3:17 p.m. The air on the second-floor landing was thick enough to chew. A foul stew of boiled cabbage from 2C and the cloying sweetness of the cigar clamped in Mr. Gable's teeth. Heat radiated from the asphalt of the parking lot below, shimmering in waves that distorted the already grim view of stained concrete and overflowing dumpsters. Leo stood frozen halfway up the stairs, his small hand gripping the rusted iron railing, the plastic handle of his grocery bag cutting into his fingers. Inside, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and a small box of crayons were growing heavy. He was 7. His world had shrunk to the distance between the front door of their apartment, 3B, and the bottom of this staircase. Today, that world was blocked. Mr. Gable, the landlord, filled the space, his bulk straining the seams of a sweat-stained polo shirt. He wasn't looking at Leo, but his presence was a wall. He was talking to Mrs. Henderson from 2A, his voice a low, gravelly thing that sounded like rocks grinding together. Rules are rules, Carol. The noise complaints are piling up. Little feet sound like elephants up there. He took a long, wet draw from his cigar, exhaling a plume of smoke that hung in the dead air like a malevolent spirit. Leo's breath hitched. They didn't make noise. His mother, Sarah, was a ghost in their own home, her footsteps whispers on the worn linoleum. She taught him to be a mouse, to play with his drawing pads and his books, to build silent cities with worn wooden blocks. The elephants were a lie. From the cracked open door of 3B, Sarah watched, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She could see the rigid line of her son's back, the way his shoulders were hunched up to his ears. Fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. Her every instinct screamed to run out, to scoop him up and retreat into the fragile safety of their apartment. But she knew that would only make it worse. It would be a confession of noise, an admission of guilt. It would give Gable the satisfaction. So she waited, a prisoner behind her own door, her knuckles white where she gripped the wood. Across the street, parked under the meager shade of a dying maple tree, a motorcycle idled. It was a big machine, a Harley, its chrome catching the brutal afternoon sun. The man sitting on it was as large as the bike, built of leather and denim and stillness. His name was Marcus, but the patch on his vest read Wrench. He was methodically tightening a bolt on his handlebars, but his eyes, shielded by dark glasses, were not on his work. He was watching the boy on the stairs. He'd seen him before. He'd seen the landlord, too. He knew the look of a predator and the posture of prey. Just then, a police cruiser drifted down the street, slow and lazy. Sarah's hope flared for a half-second before it was extinguished. The officer in the passenger seat glanced at the apartment building, his eyes sliding over the scene on the stairs without registering it, and then he looked away, distracted by something on his phone. The car didn't slow. It just kept rolling, a symbol of an order that did not apply here on the staircase at 3:18 p.m. Wrench stopped turning his tool. He watched the police car disappear around the corner. He looked back at the boy who hadn't moved a muscle. He saw the landlord flick his cigar ash onto the step just below the child's worn sneakers. A small act of casual contempt. Wrench's hand tightened on the chrome wrench in his grip, the metal cool against his skin. The engine of his bike, a low, rhythmic rumble, seemed to deepen, a growl held in the throat of the machine. He did nothing. He just watched and waited. The world held its breath in the suffocating heat. The next morning, the air in the 12th precinct was stale with the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant. Sarah sat on a hard plastic chair, the vinyl sticking to the back of her legs. She clutched a thin manila folder to her chest, a flimsy shield against the profound indifference of the room. Across the desk, Officer Miller finished his mouthful of donut, wiped his fingers on his uniform trousers, and leaned back, the leather of his duty belt creaking in protest. He had a broad, placid face that might have been reassuring under other circumstances. Here it was a mask of bureaucratic apathy. So, he said, his voice flat, a landlord dispute, it wasn't a question. It was a categorization, a dismissal, a box to put her problem in so he wouldn't have to look at it too closely. It's more than that, Sarah said. her own voice quieter than she'd intended. She cleared her throat. It's harassment. He's targeting us. He's targeting my son. Officer Miller picked up a pen and tapped it on a form. A rhythmic tick-tock that measured her wasting time. Mr. Gable? Frank Gable? Owns half the properties on that block. Been a respected member of this community for 30 years. Pillar of the local business association. He said the words like a benediction, as if they rendered any accusation against the man null and void. I've kept a log, Sarah insisted, pushing the folder across the desk. It felt impossibly light, its contents inadequate to convey the weight of the dread she lived with every day. The dates, the times, what he says, the way he follows Leo in the hall. Last week he shut off our hot water for 2 days, said it was emergency repairs, but no one ever came. He plays music right below Leo's bedroom until 2 in the morning. Miller didn't open the folder. He nudged it with a thick finger, aligning its edge with the edge of his desk. Ma'am, buildings are noisy. Pipes break. People play music. And kids can be dramatic. They have active imaginations. He gave her a look that was meant to be conspiratorial, a shared, weary parental understanding. Felt like a slap. My son is not being dramatic. He's terrified. He has nightmares. He used to love to draw, now all he draws are dark shapes. Big men with no faces. Her voice cracked on the last words. A fissure of raw emotion she hadn't wanted to reveal. Miller sighed, the sound of a patient man pushed to his limit. Look, Mrs. Jensen. Unless he has physically threatened you or your son, unless he has laid a hand on either of you, there is nothing here for us to do. This is a civil matter. My advice? Pay your rent on time, keep the noise down, and maybe bake him some cookies. A little kindness goes a long way. He finally picked up the folder, but only to place it in a wire basket on the corner of his desk marked Civil Complaints. It was a graveyard of paper. He hadn't read a single word she had written. He hadn't looked at the photograph she'd taken of the dead rat left on their welcome mat. He hadn't listened. She was being managed, handled, processed. The system hadn't failed. It had performed exactly as designed. Protected men like Frank Gable from women like her. Sarah stood up, her legs unsteady. The institutional gray of the walls seemed to press in on her. She was invisible. Her fear was inconvenient. Her son's terror was a childish fantasy. Thank you for your time, officer, she murmured, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She walked out of the precinct and back into the oppressive heat of the day, the manila folder's absence making her feel even more exposed than before. She had followed the rules. She had sought help through the proper channels. And the channels had led nowhere. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. Their apartment 3B was small, but it was clean. It smelled of cinnamon and yeast, the ghost of the pastries Sarah baked during her overnight shift at the downtown bakery. It was a scent of weary love, of providing. The worn floral sofa was covered with a faded quilt, and the small kitchen table was always set for 2, a silent testament to their small, fiercely protected world. On the refrigerator, a gallery of Leo's artwork was held in place by chipped alphabet magnets. At the top were the older drawings. Vibrant suns with smiling faces, lopsided houses with smoke curling from the chimneys, and a whole legion of brightly colored superheroes with capes and fantastic powers. They were bold and full of life, but as you moved down the fridge door, the drawings changed. The colors became muted, then dark. The superheroes disappeared, replaced by scribbled black shapes that crowded the edges of the paper. One drawing, tucked behind a magnet shaped like the letter Z, showed a small stick figure at the top of a staircase, and a much larger, rounder figure at the bottom, its form a dense block of angry black crayon. It had no face, just 2 small, red dots for eyes. Sarah had found it in Leo's sketchbook, and her blood had run cold. She hadn't had the heart to throw it away, but she couldn't bear to look at it either. This was the true cost, the evidence that mattered more than any logbook. It was the theft of her son's light. Their evenings were a ritual of reclamation. After a simple dinner, she would lock the door, sliding the deadbolt she'd installed herself, and then wedge the back of a kitchen chair under the knob. It was a flimsy barricade, more symbolic than effective, but it was an action. It was something she could do. Then she would draw the curtains, shutting out the dying light and the view of the parking lot where Gable sometimes stood, watching, smoking. They would sit on the sofa, a fortress of two, and she would read to him from a book of myths or adventures, her voice low and steady, trying to build a wall of words against the fear. "I will always keep you safe, Leo," she would whisper into his hair as she tucked him into bed. It was a promise that felt more like a prayer with each passing day. A prayer against the sound of Gable's heavy footsteps in the hall, against the sudden, jarring slam of his door downstairs, against the low rumble of his voice that could carry through the floorboards, a constant, menacing vibration. She worked while Leo slept, leaving just before midnight, kissing his forehead and trusting a sleeping 7-year-old to be safe behind a locked door and a wedged chair for the 6 hours she was gone. The anxiety was a physical thing, a knot in her stomach that never fully loosened. Every siren she heard from the bakery's kitchen was, for a terrifying second, heading for her street, for her son. She was a good tenant. She paid her rent 5 days early, every month. She bleached the grout in the bathroom and scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees. She was trying to be so small, so perfect, so utterly unobtrusive that they would be left alone. But she was beginning to understand that their quietness wasn't a defense. To a man like Gable, it was an invitation. It was the silence of a mouse in a house with a cat. The pressure mounted in small, suffocating increments. The harassment became a calculated campaign of psychological warfare, designed to fray her nerves and break her spirit. One Tuesday, the water in their kitchen sink slowed to a rusty trickle, then stopped. When she called Gable, he was unconcerned. "Big plumbing issue in the main line," he'd said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "Gonna take a few days. You understand, yet, the water pressure in the laundry room in the basement was fine." For 3 days, Sarah hauled buckets of water up the stairs, her arms aching, her dignity eroding with every trip. On the 4th day, the water came back on as suddenly as it had stopped, with no sign of a plumber, no evidence of any work having been done. It was a demonstration of power. He could turn off her life and turn it back on at his whim. Then came the noise. Not from them, but at them. Gable had a new stereo system, and he seemed determined to test its limits. At 11 o'clock at night, just as Leo was falling into a restless sleep, the floorboards would begin to vibrate. A heavy, pounding bass line would throb up through the mattress, a relentless, intrusive pulse that made the windows rattle and the pictures on the wall tremble. It wasn't music. It was a weapon. Sarah would go to Leo's bed and hold him, humming into his ear, trying to counter the ugly rhythm with a melody of her own. She called the police twice about the noise. The first time, no one came. The second time, an officer arrived an hour later, but by then, the music was off. Gable met them at his door, a picture of bewildered innocence. "Music? Officer, I've been reading a book." The tenant upstairs, "She's a bit high-strung." The officer had looked at Sarah with pity and suspicion. Her exhaustion was mistaken for instability. Her desperation was read as hysteria. She kept documenting everything. Her phone was a library of small terrors. A photo of the glue someone had squirted into their deadbolt, which took her an hour to clean out with a needle and solvent. A short audio recording, captured by holding her phone to the floor, of Gable shouting at someone on his phone, the words "that single mother in 3B, and find a way to get her out," clearly audible through the static. She sent another email to the City Housing Authority, attaching her log and the new evidence. She received an automated reply. "Thank you for your submission. Your case number is 774B91. A representative will contact you in 10 to 15 business days." 10 to 15 business days was a lifetime. Fear became the third resident in their apartment. It sat with them at the dinner table. It lay between them on the sofa as they read. It followed Leo down the hall to the bathroom at night. He stopped drawing altogether. His box of crayons sat untouched on the shelf, a colorful monument to a joy that had been stolen. He spoke less, his eyes constantly darting toward the door, listening, always listening. One afternoon, Sarah found him sitting in his closet with the door shut, his knees pulled up to his chest. He was just sitting in the dark, in the silence. When she opened the door, he didn't even look up. "I'm being a mouse," he whispered. "So the cat can't hear me." That night, Sarah didn't sleep at all. She sat in the dark living room, staring at the chair wedged under the doorknob, and understood. This couldn't go on. A line had been crossed. This was no longer about a bad landlord. This was about saving her son. Leo had noticed the man with the motorcycle. He was there most afternoons, a quiet, unmoving landmark across the street. He never bothered anyone. He just sat with his bike, sometimes cleaning a piece of chrome until it shone like a mirror, other times just looking at the building. He was big and wore a black leather vest with a picture on the back. But he didn't seem scary like Mr. Gable. He seemed calm, like a rock. Sarah was at work. It was late afternoon, and the sun cast long, distorted shadows across the parking lot. Leo was supposed to be watching a cartoon, but the volume was so low he could barely hear it. He could, however, hear Mr. Gable in the hallway, talking loudly on his phone. His voice a familiar, ugly sound that made the back of Leo's neck prickle. A surge of something hot and sharp moved through Leo's small body. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else, something that wanted to push back. He thought of his grandfather, who had passed away 2 years ago. Grandpa Mike had been a mechanic, his hands always smelling of oil and steel. He had taught Leo how to hold a wrench, how to listen to an engine. He had a tattoo on his forearm, a knight's shield with a single gear in the center. "This means we protect the machine," his grandfather had told him, his voice a warm rumble. "And people are the most important machines there are. You see the symbol, you know it's someone who fixes what's broken. Someone who protects, acting on an impulse he didn't understand." Leo scrambled to his feet. He went to his art shelf, his fingers finding the familiar shape of a crayon. He didn't grab the black one. He grabbed a royal blue. On a small, torn piece of drawing paper he drew the shield. It was wobbly and imperfect, but the shape was right. Inside it, he drew a circle with small teeth around it. A gear. He paused, then turned the paper over. With a pencil, in the blocky, uncertain letters of a 7-year-old, he wrote their apartment number, 3B. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the low thrum of Gable's voice from the hall. He cracked open the apartment door. Gable had his back to him, pacing near the stairwell. Leo slipped out, a tiny shadow in the dim hallway. He didn't run down the stairs. He flew. His sneakers made no sound on the worn treads. He burst out the front door into the blinding sunlight, his eyes fixed on the man and the motorcycle. Wrench looked up, surprised, as the small boy came running full tilt across the asphalt. The kid didn't say a word. He just ran right up to him, his face pale and his eyes wide, and shoved the folded piece of paper into his gloved hand. The paper was warm and slightly damp from his sweaty palm. Before Wrench could react, before he could even form a question, the boy turned and bolted, disappearing back into the shadowy maw of the building as quickly as he had appeared. Wrench sat there for a moment, the strange encounter settling around him. He looked at the folded paper in his hand. He carefully unfolded it. He saw the child's drawing, the wobbly shield, the simple gear. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the exact design of his club's patch, but it was from the same family, an old service emblem from the mechanized divisions, a symbol that had its roots in the Second World War. It was a sign passed down from fathers to sons, a piece of an almost forgotten code. It meant a brother was in trouble. It meant a machine was broken. It meant a call for help from someone who knew the language of protectors. He turned the paper over and saw the penciled 3B. He looked from the drawing to the 3rd floor of the grim, brick building. A broken machine. A child in trouble. The catalyst had been delivered. The time for just watching was over. Wrench, whose name was Marcus Thorne, stared at the small drawing for a full minute. The crayon was smeared, the paper creased from the boy's tight grip. It was the most potent message he had received in years. He carefully folded it and tucked it into the breast pocket of his vest, placing it next to a worn photo of his own daughter. He swung a leg off his bike, his movements deliberate, imbued with a new and solemn purpose. He pulled out his phone. His first call was to his chapter president, a man they called Deacon. The call was short. "Deacon, it's Wrench. I have a code 3B. Cub is involved. Location is 455 Sycamore." There was a pause on the other end, then a single grim word. Acknowledged. That was all that was needed. Code 3B was their own designation, an alert for a situation involving a child in imminent but non-violent peril, a scenario requiring presence, not force. The Cub designation elevated its priority to the highest level. The call set in motion a chain of communication that was faster and more efficient than any corporate email blast. Deacon made 2 calls. Those 2 men made 2 calls each. The message fanned out through the network of the Iron Saviors Motorcycle Club, a brotherhood built not on outlaw posturing, but on a shared history of military service and blue-collar work. The alert appeared on phones in garages where men were tuning engines, on construction sites where they were hanging drywall, in warehouses where they were loading trucks. 4:05 p.m. In a quiet suburban garage 30 miles away, a man named Ghost, a network engineer by day, wiped grease from his hands with a rag, nodded at the text on his phone, and walked to his gleaming Indian Roadmaster. He hit the ignition, the engine roaring to life and echoing off the neatly organized tool chests. 4:30 p.m. In the kitchen of a bustling downtown restaurant, Chef, a towering man with forearms covered in culinary tattoos and old road burns, read the message. He spoke quietly to his sous chef, untied his apron, and walked out the back door, leaving a half-prepped tray of scallops on the counter. His Ducati was parked in the alley. 5:15 p.m. From 3 counties the head count grew. 12 became 37. 37 became 68. They came from different chapters, different lives, mechanics, electricians, veterans, a high school history teacher, a freight hauler, a librarian. They were not coming for a brawl. The message was explicit. Silent roll-in. No colors on display. Vests reversed or covered. Formation parking. Stand by for witness protocol. Legal is en route. This was a mobilization, not a party. While the bikes were starting, Wrench made 2 more calls. The first was to Maria Flores, a sharp, tireless pro bono lawyer who had worked with the club before, specializing in housing disputes and child advocacy. He gave her the address and a summary of his observations. "I'm sending you a file," he said. "Our intel guy is running the landlord's name. You should have something to work with by the time you get there." The second call was to a freelance journalist, a man who valued truth over sensationalism. "Pete, I've got a potential story for you. Sycamore Street. Number 455. Be there at 6. Bring your camera. No promises, but you might see what a community looks like when it shows up." The preparation was a quiet, humming montage of purpose. Men checking tire pressure, filling gas tanks, zipping up jackets. There were no battle cries, no boasts. There was only the grim, determined focus of men who understood the mission. This was not about vengeance. It was about creating an undeniable, unassailable public space where a scared woman and her child could finally be heard. It was about fixing a broken machine. By 5:45 p.m., 71 motorcycles had gathered at a staging point, a disused gas station 2 miles from Sycamore Street. Wrench rolled in the 72nd. He saw the sea of chrome and steel, the silent, waiting men. He nodded at Deacon. The time was now. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. Sycamore Street was quiet, caught in the lull between the end of the workday and the start of the evening. Children's bicycles lay abandoned on patchy lawns. The sound of a distant television drifted from an open window. Then came the thunder. It started as a low, almost imperceptible vibration, the kind you feel in your teeth before you hear with your ears. It grew steadily, a deep, resonant rumble that was too synchronized, too massive to be a passing truck or a summer storm. Heads began to pop out of doorways. Curtains were pulled back. The sound grew, swelling into a rolling wave of controlled power. At precisely 6 p.m., the first 2 motorcycles turned onto Sycamore Street. Then 2 more, and 2 more. They moved in a flawless 2x2 formation, their engines humming at a low, respectful RPM. There was no aggressive revving, no shouting, no display of outlaw bravado. This was the discipline of a military procession. 72 motorcycles, a river of polished chrome and dark leather, flowed onto the residential street. They systematically filled every available parking space on both sides of the block, their alignment perfect, their spacing exact. The effect was staggering. In under 3 minutes, the ordinary street was transformed into a silent, unmoving fortress of steel. The residents of Sycamore Street stood on their porches in stunned silence. This was not the chaotic biker gang from the movies. This was something else entirely. This was organized. This was intentional. Wrench, his bike parked directly opposite the entrance to number 455, swung his leg over and dismounted. He removed his helmet, tucked it under his arm, and took up a position on the public sidewalk. He didn't step on the property. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the third-floor window of apartment 3B. One by one, 71 other men and women did the same, creating a silent, unmoving perimeter along the street. They formed a human wall of witness. From his own window, Frank Gable saw the spectacle. His face, initially curious, twisted into a mask of indignant rage. He stormed out of the front door, his polo shirt already dark with sweat. "What the hell is this?" he bellowed, his voice unnaturally loud in the sudden, profound quiet. "This is private property. You can't park here. I'm calling the cops." He jabbed a thick finger at Wrench. Wrench didn't flinch. He didn't respond. His eyes didn't even flicker in Gable's direction. His focus remained on the building. His silence was more unnerving to Gable than any threat would have been. It was a complete and utter dismissal of his authority, his power. Gable sputtered, his blustering fury deflating into confused anxiety. He looked up and down the street at the silent, watching figures. They weren't looking at him. They were simply there, bearing witness. A quiet, unassuming sedan pulled into one of the last remaining spots. A man with a press pass hanging from his neck got out, a camera in his hand. He didn't approach the bikers. He started filming from a distance, documenting the surreal, powerful stillness of the scene. The trap had not been sprung. It had simply been built piece by piece right in front of everyone. And Frank Gable was standing in the middle of it. Just as Gable's impotent shouting reached a fever pitch, a second sedan, a practical and well-kept Toyota, parked behind the journalist's car. Maria Flores stepped out. She was a small woman, but she moved with an energy that seemed to bend space around her. She carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression of calm, unshakable focus. She walked past the sputtering landlord as if he were a piece of lawn furniture, her eyes scanning the building, the silent bikers, and the growing number of neighbors peeking from their homes. She approached Wrench. "Marcus," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "What do we have?" Wrench didn't turn his gaze from the building. "Landlord is Frank Gable. We've just sent his file to your phone. A history of tenant complaints, all dismissed or settled with non-disclosure agreements. Focus on single mothers. 4 evictions in the last 2 years were followed by harassment claims that went nowhere. The boy in 3B made contact. His mother, Sarah Jensen, filed a complaint with a P.D. Officer Miller this morning. It was ignored." Maria nodded, already scrolling through the file on her phone. "And Mrs. Jensen's own evidence? We believe she has it, but no one has been willing to look at it," Wrench said. "That's about to change." The flashing lights of a patrol car finally appeared at the end of the street. The car slowed, its occupants clearly bewildered by the scene. It wasn't Officer Miller. It was a sergeant, a man with 20 years on the force and weary eyes that had seen everything. He got out of the car, his hand resting cautiously on his belt. Maria met him halfway. "Sergeant," she said, extending a hand. "Maria Flores. I'm an attorney representing Sarah Jensen of apartment 3B. She presented the file. Not just the digital version, but a neatly printed and bound copy that one of the bikers produced from a saddlebag. This contains a log of harassment incidents, photographic evidence, and audio recordings, along with a background report on Mr. Frank Gable and a list of 6 former tenants willing to give statements about his pattern of behavior. The sergeant's eyes widened slightly as he took the heavy binder. The journalist, Pete, was now closer, his camera rolling, capturing the entire exchange. Emboldened by the protective presence of the bikers and the arrival of a lawyer, a door creaked open. Mrs. Henderson from 2A stepped out. "He did it to me too," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Shut off my heat last winter for a week. Said my grandson made too much noise when he visited." Another door opened. A young man from the first floor. "He lost 3 of my rent checks and tried to evict me for non-payment. I had the bank records to prove it, but I had to fight him for 2 months." A chorus began to rise. The silent community, long cowed by Gable's bullying, had found its voice. Gable stood frozen on the lawn, his face pale, his mask of righteous indignation crumbling to reveal the pathetic bully beneath. The truth was surfacing, not in a shout, but in a steady, undeniable tide of testimony, all under the watchful, silent gaze of 72 guardians and the unblinking eye of a camera. The sergeant looked from the binder in his hands to the faces of the tenants, to the stone-faced bikers, and then to the sweating, cornered landlord. The simple landlord dispute had just become a major public incident. The sergeant made the call. Within 20 minutes, 2 more squad cars arrived, carrying detectives. Maria Flores, calm and methodical, walked them through the evidence. She played them the audio Sarah had recorded. The landlord's voice, tinny but clear, plotting to get her out. She showed them the photo of the dead animal on the doormat, time-stamped. She presented the sworn affidavits from the former tenants that the Iron Saviors Network had managed to track down and get notarized in the span of 90 minutes. It was an overwhelming, meticulously prepared case, dropped into their laps in a way they could not ignore. With a crowd of witnesses, a lawyer, and a journalist recording every move, procedure had to be followed to the letter. A judge was called and a warrant was granted based on the evidence of utility tampering and harassment. 2 detectives, along with the sergeant, approached the front door of the building. Gable, who had retreated inside, refused to open his apartment. They forced entry. While they conducted their search, Sarah Jensen's bus pulled up at the end of the street. She saw the police cars, the crowd, the impossible line of motorcycles, and her heart seized with terror. She thought something had happened to Leo. She broke into a run, her bakery uniform smudged with flour, her face etched with panic. Wrench saw her coming and stepped forward to intercept her. His presence a solid, calming barrier. "Mrs. Jensen," he said, his voice gentle. "Your son is safe. He's upstairs in your apartment. We've been watching the door." Sarah stared at him, then at the silent army behind him, her mind struggling to process the scene. What is all this?" "Your son called for a repair," Wrench said simply. He held out the small, creased piece of paper. "He gave me this." She took the drawing of the shield and the gear, her own son's brave, desperate message. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of fear and confusion turning into something else entirely. Relief, gratitude, a profound, bone-deep sense of being seen. Just then, the detectives emerged from the building, escorting a handcuffed Frank Gable. His face was a thunderous mask of disbelief and humiliation as the journalist's camera flashed. "We found the main water shutoff for 3B bypassed and controlled by a secondary valve in his closet," the sergeant explained to Maria, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The wiring for the circuit that controls her outlets shows signs of recent tampering." The evidence was direct and irrefutable. As they put Gable into the back of a police car, his reign of quiet terror over the tenants of 455 Sycamore Street came to a sudden, public, and deeply satisfying end. The community of neighbors broke into scattered, spontaneous applause. Maria Flores put a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "It's over," she said. "We'll file for an emergency restraining order and start civil proceedings tomorrow. You and your son are safe now." Sarah looked at the faces of the bikers, these strangers who had formed a silent, protective wall around her life. Wrench stepped forward again and pressed a small, heavy object into her hand. It was a brand new, high-security deadbolt, still in its packaging. "Every machine needs the right parts to stay secure," he said. The simple, practical gift, a promise of future safety, was more eloquent than 1,000 words. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Sycamore Stand became a piece of local legend. Pete's article, accompanied by the powerful images of the silent bikers and the tenants finding their voices, was picked up by national news outlets. The narrative was compelling. A small boy's courageous act, a mother's quiet endurance, and a community's unorthodox but effective intervention where the official system had failed. The public fallout was significant. Frank Gable was convicted not only of harassment and utility tampering but also, thanks to the other tenants' testimony, of fraud and extortion. His empire of neglected properties was placed under municipal receivership, and a full-scale audit of the city's housing authority was launched. The internal investigation at the police department led to Officer Miller's suspension and a complete overhaul of how civil complaints were processed, ensuring they were reviewed by a supervising officer and not just dismissed at the front desk. Sarah and Leo's life transformed. With Gable gone, a profound quiet settled over their apartment. Not the fearful silence of mice, but the calm, peaceful silence of a home. The chair was no longer wedged under the doorknob. The new deadbolt wrench had given her was installed, its heavy, satisfying thunk, a nightly reminder of their hard-won security. The iron saviors did not disappear. They became a quiet presence in the neighborhood. A few of them would ride by every few days, a low rumble of reassurance. They organized a community barbecue, flipping burgers and talking to the residents, demystifying their leather-clad image and forging genuine connections. The fear that Gable had cultivated on the block was replaced by a new, tentative sense of solidarity. But the most significant change was born from the event itself. Maria Flores, working with the leadership of the Iron Saviors, established a new nonprofit organization. They called it the Shield and Gear Fund. Its mission was to provide rapid, pro bono legal aid and tenant advocacy for people facing landlord harassment, specifically for vulnerable single-parent families. The fund was seeded by a large anonymous donation from a national veterans organization that had heard the story. The logo for the fund was, of course, a faithful, professionally rendered version of the drawing Leo had made on that desperate afternoon. His simple shield and gear became a public symbol of protection, a sign that help was available for those who felt unheard. Sarah Jensen became the fund's first community outreach coordinator, her first-hand experience making her a powerful and empathetic advocate for others caught in the same nightmare she had escaped. Dignity was restored not just by the legal victory, but by the transformation of her pain into a source of strength and help for others. The cycle of abuse was broken and replaced by a cycle of protection. The legacy of that one afternoon on Sycamore Street rippled outward in ways no one could have anticipated. The Shield and Gear Fund became a model for other cities, a novel partnership between a legal aid society and a community organization that could provide not just legal muscle, but also the crucial element of public presence and witness. Chapters of the Iron Saviors in other states began to adopt the Code 3B protocol, creating their own local networks to protect vulnerable families. The club's public image, long dogged by stereotypes, underwent a dramatic shift. They were no longer just bikers. They were guardians. They were the people you called when the system failed you. The most profound legacy, however, was quieter and more personal. It was in the way Mrs. Henderson no longer flinched when she heard footsteps in the hall. It was in the way the tenants of 455 Sycamore now held monthly potlucks in the courtyard, a space they had all been too intimidated to use before. It was in the laughter that now echoed freely from the building. One crisp autumn afternoon, months later, Leo sat on a park bench, his drawing pad resting on his knees. The sunlight filtered through the golden leaves of the maple trees, dappling the page. He was drawing again, his crayons moving with a fluid, confident energy that had been absent for so long. He was drawing superheroes. They were big and strong, with flowing capes, but this time they weren't flying. They were riding magnificent, gleaming motorcycles, their engines spitting stylized bursts of color. Sarah watched him from a nearby bench, a soft smile on her face. The knot of anxiety that had lived in her stomach for more than a year was finally gone, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. She saw the change in her son not just in his drawings, but in his posture. His shoulders were relaxed. He no longer walked like a mouse. He walked like a boy who knew he was safe. A low, familiar rumble caused her to look up. Across the park, parked on the street, were two motorcycles. Wrench and Deacon sat on their bikes, not looking over, giving the family their space, but simply being there. It wasn't a patrol or an obligation. It was a quiet promise, a statement that protection wasn't a one-time event, but an enduring commitment. Leo looked up from his drawing and saw them. He didn't run or hide. He smiled, a wide, gap-toothed grin, and gave a small wave. Wrench raised a gloved hand in return. The exchange was brief, simple, and contained a universe of meaning. The machine was fixed. The boy who had forgotten how to draw heroes was drawing them again, inspired by the real ones who had answered his call. The community had learned that the strongest walls aren't made of brick and mortar, but of courage, witness, and the thunder of 72 engines arriving right on time.